Imagine a man who stood at the very edge of American history, not as a hero, not as a founding father celebrated in textbooks, but as a ghost. A ghost who shook hands with Thomas Jefferson, who pressed a pistol against Alexander Hamilton's chest on a foggy New Jersey morning, and who once, in the shadows of the early republic, plotted to tear the United States apart and hand its western territories to foreign powers. Imagine a man who came within a single vote of becoming President of the United States. A man brilliant enough to reshape the nation and corrupt enough to destroy it. His name was Aaron Burr. And the story you think you know about him is only the beginning. Before we continue, comment below with the country you're watching from, and if you enjoy forgotten history, subscribe and join our community of history lovers from around the world. There is a reason Aaron Burr does not appear on currency. There is a reason his name is spoken with a peculiar combination of fascination and disgust, even 250 years after his birth. It is not simply because he killed Alexander Hamilton, though that alone would be enough to cement a dark legacy. It is because Aaron Burr represents something the young American Republic could barely bring itself to acknowledge. The possibility that its own architects were capable of betrayal on a scale that could have ended the American experiment entirely. The story of Aaron Burr is the story of ambition without a moral compass, of brilliance curdled into scheming, of a man who genuinely believed, perhaps until his dying day, that he deserved more than history gave him. And in a strange, unsettling way, he might have been right. The year was 1756 and Newark, New Jersey was a quiet, modest town, the kind of place where a child's entire destiny could be determined by the family name above the door. Aaron Burr Jr. was born into one of the most formidable intellectual dynasties in colonial America. His father, Aaron Burr Sr., was the second president of what would become Princeton University. His grandfather on his mother's side was Jonathan Edwards, arguably the most ferocious and brilliant theologian that American soil had ever produced. The man whose sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," had made entire congregations weep and shake with terror. Aaron Burr Jr. was, by the sheer accident of birth, the heir to a tradition of towering intellect and ferocious spiritual ambition. But the universe has a way of taking extraordinary things away from those who might need them most. By the time Aaron Burr was 2 years old, both of his parents were dead. His mother, Esther Edwards Burr, died of smallpox. His father followed weeks later, collapsing under the weight of exhaustion and illness. His grandfather, Jonathan Edwards, who was supposed to take over his care, died of a smallpox inoculation gone wrong just months later. In the span of one catastrophic year, the child Aaron Burr lost his entire world. He and his sister were taken in by an uncle, Timothy Edwards, a man who by most historical accounts was strict, cold, and spectacularly ill-suited to raising traumatized orphans. Young Aaron, by his own later account, ran away from his uncle's home at least twice before the age of 10. What does it do to a child to lose everything before he is old enough to understand what he has lost? Psychologists today might speak of attachment disorders, of the deep wound left by early abandonment. Historians who have studied Aaron Burr see in his later life a pattern that begins right here, in that Newark household, in those years of grief without language, a fierce, almost violent self-reliance. A conviction that no one was coming to save him. A belief, bone deep and unshakable, that the world owed him something it had already stolen. He entered the College of New Jersey, Princeton, at the age of 13, in a class of young men several years his senior. Aaron Burr distinguished himself almost immediately. He read voraciously, argued brilliantly, and displayed a social intelligence that seemed almost supernatural for his age. He completed his degree in 2 years. By 15, he was a college graduate with a mind like a sharpened blade and a personality that drew people toward him like moths to a particularly dangerous flame. Then came the war. The American Revolution erupted in 1775, and Aaron Burr, 19 years old, slight in frame, burning with something that could only be described as hunger, enlisted. He joined the Continental Army with a letter of introduction that should have won him an immediate commission. But even here, even at the beginning of the conflict that would define the century, Aaron Burr encountered the sensation that would follow him his entire life, the sense of being underestimated, overlooked, passed over by men less capable than himself. He had tried to attach himself to General George Washington's staff early in the war, and Washington, for reasons that history has never entirely clarified, declined to keep him close. Some historians speculate that Washington found Burr too intelligent, too independent, too likely to challenge authority. Others suggest a simple personality clash. Whatever the reason, it planted the first seed of what would grow into a poisonous mutual disregard between Aaron Burr and the men who ran the American Revolution. But that dismissal could not stop what Aaron Burr was capable of when he was actually given the chance to perform. The Quebec campaign of 1775 remains one of the most grueling military expeditions in American history. Benedict Arnold, not yet a traitor, still a hero, led a column of Continental soldiers through the Maine wilderness in the dead of autumn, through swamps and frozen rivers and killing cold, to strike at the British stronghold of Quebec City. Aaron Burr was there. He marched through that wilderness alongside men who were dropping dead of hunger and exposure, and he did not falter. He distinguished himself so completely that Arnold himself praised his conduct. But Quebec fell. The assault failed. The dead lay in the snow before the city's walls, and Aaron Burr walked away from the smoking ruin of that campaign carrying something new inside him, not just survival, but a cold, crystalline understanding of just how thin the line was between glory and catastrophe. He went on. In 1776, serving under General Israel Putnam in Manhattan, as the British invasion overwhelmed the Continental positions, Burr helped organize the retreat that saved an entire brigade from encirclement and capture. Historians have estimated that his actions that day saved the lives of hundreds of American soldiers. He received a promotion, eventually rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel, commanding a regiment with a discipline and effectiveness that drew widespread praise. And yet George Washington never fully embraced him. And yet the promotion he felt he deserved always seemed to arrive slightly late, or slightly smaller than he expected. And yet, in 1779, his health collapsing under the strain of years of campaigning, Aaron Burr resigned his commission. He was 23 years old, a war hero by any objective measure, and he felt in some fundamental way that the revolution he had bled for had not adequately recognized what he had given it. That feeling, that sense of being owed more than he had been given, would never leave him. He studied law after the war, in a spectacularly compressed period that became almost legendary among the New York legal community. While most lawyers spent years reading Blackstone and attending court, Aaron Burr absorbed the law with the same ferocious speed he had absorbed everything else, and was admitted to the New York bar in 1782 after a mere 6 months of study. Within years he was one of the most sought-after attorneys in the city, known for his razor-sharp mind, his theatrical courtroom presence, and his absolute willingness to take cases that other lawyers found too risky or too controversial. He also married. In 1782, he wed Theodosia Bartow Prevost, a widow 10 years his senior, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and warmth who became, by all accounts, the great love of his life. She bore him a daughter, also named Theodosia, and the younger Theodosia would become the most important relationship Aaron Burr would ever have. He educated her as he had never been educated, flooding her childhood with books and ideas and languages, treating her as an equal intellect from the time she could hold a pen. He was, by the accounts of everyone who knew him, a devoted and somewhat astonishing father, and in 1794 Theodosia the Elder, his wife his anchor, perhaps the last person capable of softening what he was becoming, died of stomach cancer. Aaron Burr was alone again, just as he had been at 2 years old, and this time there was nothing left to lose. He turned his full attention to politics. The New York political landscape of the 1790s was a battlefield unlike anything fought with muskets and cannon. It was a war of influence, patronage, newspaper columns, and back-room deals, and Aaron Burr proved to be a natural warrior in this particular arena. He built political organizations from the ground up, cultivated loyalty through personal charm and meticulous attention to detail, and developed a talent for the kind of quiet, effective machine politics that would not be named or theorized until decades after his death. In 1791, running against the incumbent Philip Schuyler, Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law, Aaron Burr won election to the United States Senate. Hamilton was furious, and here is where the story that everyone thinks they know actually begins. Because the relationship between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton was not simply a rivalry. It was something deeper and stranger and more psychologically complex than a mere political feud. These were two men who in many ways were reflections of each other, who had fought in the same war, who practiced in the same legal circles, who moved through the same New York society. They were in certain moods capable of genuine mutual respect, but they were also, at a fundamental level, competitors for the same thing, the recognition, the power, the legacy that both of them believed they uniquely deserved. Hamilton had won that competition, at least on paper. As the first Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton had already done something extraordinary. He had built the financial architecture of the United States, had argued the case for federal assumption of state debts and the establishment of a national bank, had positioned himself as the intellectual force behind the Federalist cause. His name was already becoming synonymous with American financial genius, but Burr was catching up, and Hamilton, watching that ascent, did something that would eventually cost him his life. He talked. Hamilton talked about Aaron Burr to anyone who would listen. He said Burr was dangerous. He said Burr was unprincipled. He said, in a letter that would survive to be read at the worst possible moment, that he had a still more despicable opinion of Aaron Burr that he could not state in polite company. The precise nature of that unpublishable opinion has been debated by historians for over 2 centuries. Some believe it referred to rumors about Burr's personal morality, his well-documented reputation as a womanizer, his reported affairs with married women, and possibly with women of various social backgrounds in ways that polite society found scandalous. Others believe it was purely political, referring to some scheme or conspiracy that Hamilton had uncovered or suspected. Whatever it was, Hamilton kept saying it, and Burr kept hearing it. The year 1800 brought the most extraordinary electoral crisis in American history, the presidential election between the Federalists, John Adams seeking a second term, and the Democratic Republicans. Thomas Jefferson, at the top of the ticket, ended in a result that the framers of the Constitution had never anticipated. Under the original rules, each elector cast 2 votes for president. The candidate with the most votes became president. The runner-up became vice president. Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr each received 73 electoral votes, exactly the same number. The election was thrown to the House of Representatives. What happened in the House of Representatives during the winter of 1800 to 1801 was a genuine constitutional crisis, the kind that history books tend to smooth over, but that, in real time, felt like the entire republic might shatter. 35 ballots were cast over 6 days. The Federalists, who despised Jefferson, considered throwing their support behind Burr, making him president instead, outmaneuvering their political enemies through the back door. Alexander Hamilton, despite everything he felt about Thomas Jefferson, could not bring himself to support Aaron Burr. He lobbied furiously, writing letter after letter to Federalist congressmen, arguing that Jefferson, for all his faults, was at least a man of principle who would not actually destroy American institutions. Burr, Hamilton argued, would. On the 36th ballot, Jefferson was elected. Aaron Burr became Vice President of the United States. He had come within a single congressional vote of the presidency, and he knew, everyone knew, that Hamilton had kept it from him. The vice presidency in those early years of the Republic was not the position it would later become. It held little real power, offered minimal influence over policy, and provided enormous opportunity for a man of ambition to feel the slow, grinding humiliation of being present at the feast, but never seated at the main table. Burr presided over the Senate with what observers described as genuine skill and impartiality. He was, by most accounts, a superb parliamentary manager. But Thomas Jefferson, who had reason to distrust him even before the election crisis, essentially froze him out of the administration. No meaningful appointments, no real consultation, no path forward. By 1804, Aaron Burr knew his future in national Democratic, Republican politics was finished. He turned to New York, running for governor with the support of a coalition of disaffected Federalists and anti-Jefferson Republicans. And Alexander Hamilton, one more time, opened his mouth. Hamilton campaigned against Burr with a ferocity that went beyond normal political opposition. He spoke at dinners, he wrote letters, he made it unmistakably clear to anyone who mattered in New York politics that Aaron Burr was not merely a bad choice. He was a dangerous man, a man without principle, a man who could not be trusted with power. Burr lost the governor's race decisively. It was a humiliation he might have survived. Politics is full of defeats, but then came the letter. Dr. Charles D. Cooper had written a letter after a dinner party at which Hamilton had spoken, summarizing Hamilton's remarks about Burr. The letter was published in a newspaper. It described Hamilton as having expressed a still more despicable opinion of Burr. That phrase, that maddening, deliberately vague phrase, was the spark that lit the fuse. Burr wrote to Hamilton demanding an explanation. Hamilton's response was careful, legalistic, technically non-committal. He could not recall every word he had ever spoken at every dinner party. He did not consider himself responsible for the characterizations made by others. Burr wrote back. Hamilton replied. The correspondence spiraled, each letter increasing the pressure, Burr demanding a clear disavowal, Hamilton refusing to provide one without knowing precisely what he was being asked to disavow. The duel was set for July 11, 1804, at Weehawken, New Jersey, on a ledge above the Hudson River that had been used for duels before, including, in a terrible foreshadowing, by Hamilton's own son Philip, who had died on that same ground 3 years earlier. What actually happened that morning is one of the most debated questions in American history. The two men stood 10 paces apart in the early morning mist. Both fired. Alexander Hamilton fell. He died the following afternoon, July 12, 1804, in excruciating pain, having told those around him that he had decided before the duel to withhold his fire, to not aim at Burr, to discharge his pistol harmlessly, offering Burr a chance to step back from the brink without bloodshed. Burr's bullet had entered Hamilton's right side, passed through his liver, and lodged in his spine. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Hamilton, already a legend, became in death something even larger, a martyr, a symbol, the man of principle struck down by the man without one. Aaron Burr, sitting Vice President of the United States, was indicted for murder in both New York and New Jersey. He could not return to his home in New York without risking arrest. He fled south to Washington, where his constitutional immunity as presiding officer of the Senate technically shielded him, while Congress was in session. He returned to the Senate chamber in November of 1804 and presided over the impeachment trial of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase with a composure and dignity that left observers genuinely bewildered. Here was a man indicted for murder, the murder of the most famous man in America, presiding over one of the most significant constitutional proceedings of the era, and doing so with such perfect impartiality that senators on both sides praised his conduct. When Aaron Burr delivered his farewell address to the Senate in March of 1805, grown men wept. He spoke of the Senate as a temple of liberty and law, his voice steady, his bearing impeccable. Several senators who had served under him later said it was one of the most moving speeches they had ever heard, and then he walked out of the Senate and into the most extraordinary and most treasonous chapter of his life. What Aaron Burr did next has been debated, argued, mythologized, and condemned for more than 2 centuries. The full truth remains elusive, buried under layers of conflicting testimony, burned documents, coded letters, and the self-serving narratives of men who all had reasons to lie. But the outlines are clear enough. In the spring and summer of 1805, Aaron Burr traveled west, down the Ohio River, through the vast territories that lay beyond the Appalachian Mountains, into the world that the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had suddenly made American. He was not traveling as a tourist. He was mapping something. He was meeting people. He was making promises. The central figure in what became known as the Burr conspiracy was a man named James Wilkinson, Major General James Wilkinson, commander of the United States Army and governor of the Louisiana Territory. Wilkinson was, by most historical reckonings, the most dangerous traitor in American history, a man who had been on the Spanish government's payroll as a spy since at least 1787, while simultaneously serving as one of the highest-ranking officers of the United States military. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man that Aaron Burr would naturally find useful. The 2 men had known each other since the Revolution. Now, in 1805 and 1806, they began exchanging coded letters and meeting in person, laying plans for something that historians have argued about ever since. The precise nature of the conspiracy has been described in a dozen different ways, and the problem is that both men, Burr and Wilkinson, were congenital liars who changed their stories based on what was most advantageous at any given moment. Here is what appears to be true. Aaron Burr was recruiting men and gathering weapons and flatboats in the Western Territories with the stated intention of invading Mexico, then part of the Spanish Empire, in the event of a war between the United States and Spain. A war seemed plausible at the time. Spain and the United States were in near constant diplomatic confrontation over the boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase. Burr may genuinely have believed that a private military expedition into Spanish territory, in the tradition of the filibustering expeditions that would continue throughout the 19th century, was a legitimate entrepreneurial venture. But that was not the whole story. Because there is another version of the conspiracy, supported by some evidence and denied by Burr himself to his dying day, that goes much further. In this version, Aaron Burr was not merely planning to invade Mexico. He was planning to separate the Western Territories from the United States entirely. To peel away the lands beyond the Appalachians, forge a new nation with himself at its head, and ally that new nation with a foreign power. The foreign power he reportedly approached was Great Britain. Anthony Merry, the British minister to the United States, reported to his government in 1804 that Burr had offered to effect a separation of the western part of the United States in exchange for $500,000 and a British naval escort. Merry considered Burr serious and the scheme plausible. Think about that for a moment. The sitting Vice President of the United States, the man who had come within one congressional vote of the presidency, had allegedly approached the British government, the same government that American soldiers had bled to free themselves from just 2 decades earlier, and offered to sell them the western half of the country. The British in the end declined. Their foreign minister noted that the scheme seemed too dependent on a single ambitious man and that the geopolitical moment was not right. Burr then apparently approached the Spanish as well, who also declined, having enough to worry about with Napoleon shredding the European state system. Undeterred, Burr pressed on with what he presented publicly as the Mexico Plan. Through 1806, he recruited. He gathered followers, young men hungry for adventure and glory, wealthy backers who believed in his vision, disaffected veterans of the Revolution who felt the Republic had never given them their due. He assembled boats on an island in the Ohio River, owned by one Harmon Blennerhassett, an Irish exile of considerable wealth, who had been completely seduced by Burr's charisma and promises of empire. Blennerhassett mortgaged everything he had for the scheme, and then James Wilkinson betrayed him. In the autumn of 1806, with Burr's flotilla beginning to move down the Mississippi, Wilkinson suddenly wrote to President Jefferson exposing the conspiracy. His letter was a masterpiece of self-serving fiction, portraying Burr as the sole architect of an evil design that Wilkinson had been heroically working to undermine, conveniently omitting his own role as co-conspirator. Jefferson, who had his own complicated relationship with Burr dating back to the election of 1800, believed him, or chose to believe him, which in politics amounts to the same thing. Jefferson acted with unusual directness. He issued a presidential proclamation declaring that an unlawful enterprise was being organized against Spanish territories and ordering its suppression. Burr's enterprise collapsed almost overnight. His recruited men dispersed, his backers withdrew, his carefully laid plans dissolved like sugar in rain. Aaron Burr fled. He disguised himself as a simple traveler, trading his fine clothes for homespun wool, riding through the Alabama wilderness, trying to reach Spanish Florida, and the protection of a power he had tried to court. He was recognized near the tiny settlement of Wakefield, Alabama, by a local attorney who had once seen him in New York. He was arrested on February 19, 1807, and sent under military escort to Richmond, Virginia, to face trial for treason. The trial of Aaron Burr for treason in 1807 was the most dramatic legal proceeding in the history of the early Republic, and it turned on a question that went to the very heart of what the Constitution meant by treason. Article 3 of the Constitution defines treason narrowly and deliberately, levying war against the United States or ordering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort, and requires either a confession or the testimony of 2 witnesses to the same overt act. This definition had been written by men who were themselves technically traitors under British law and who wanted to make sure that the United States government could not prosecute political opposition as treason, as European monarchies routinely did. The presiding judge at the Burr trial was none other than Chief Justice John Marshall, who rode circuit and had been the nemesis of Thomas Jefferson's administration for years. Jefferson desperately wanted a conviction. Marshall was determined that the trial would be conducted according to the law, not according to executive preference. The prosecution's case was built primarily on the testimony of James Wilkinson, the man who had betrayed Burr, who had himself been deeply involved in the conspiracy, who had tampered with at least one key document before submitting it as evidence, and whose credibility was so thoroughly destroyed on cross-examination that the grand jury had briefly considered indicting him rather than Burr. Burr himself defended his case with brilliant legal argument, mounting what many observers considered one of the finest criminal defenses in American legal history. John Marshall's ruling on the definition of treason was so narrow, requiring proof of an actual overt act of war, with 2 witnesses to that specific act, that the prosecution could not meet the standard, Aaron Burr was acquitted of treason on September 1807. But acquittal is not the same as vindication. Burr was free, but he was destroyed. His name was synonymous in the public mind with treason. The murder indictments in New York and New Jersey still technically stood. His daughter Theodosia, his beloved Theodosia, the great project and light of his life, was married to Joseph Alston, the governor of South Carolina, but the distance between them had been growing through years of his disgrace and exile. He had no money, no allies, no political future, and no path back to the world he had inhabited. He fled to Europe. In June of 1808, Aaron Burr arrived in England, beginning 4 years of wandering exile that brought him to Britain, then to Sweden, then to Denmark, then to Germany, then to France, carrying always with him a leather journal in which he recorded everything. His thoughts, his dreams, his expenses, his sexual conquests, his schemes, his loneliness. The journal survives. It is one of the most extraordinary personal documents of the early Republic. Searingly honest, at times almost painfully self-aware, at other times displaying a capacity for self-deception so vast as to be almost admirable in its audacity. In London, Burr sought meetings with government ministers, trying to sell them, again, on schemes for separating the Western United States or for invading Spanish colonies in the Americas. The British listened politely and did nothing. He moved to Paris, where he tried the same approach with Napoleon's government, offering to help the French reclaim Louisiana. Napoleon's ministers listened, considered, and filed his proposals in the same drawer where Europe filed the schemes of harmless eccentrics. He was broke. He pawned his watch. He pawned his books. He borrowed from acquaintances who could barely afford it. He wrote letters to Theodosia that ached with longing. For her, for America, for some version of the life he felt had been stolen from him. He described in his journal the humiliation of applying for charity from strangers, of being turned away from boarding houses, of eating meals that cost less than a penny. The man who had nearly been President of the United States was begging for bread in the streets of European capitals. He finally secured passage back to America in 1812, sailing under a false name, arriving in Boston a broken old man of 56, which in the early 19th century was genuinely old, the body worn by years of campaign and exile and privation. He made his way to New York and quietly, almost invisibly, reopened his law practice. And then the cruelest blow of all. Theodosia, his daughter, his beloved Theodosia, the one person in the world who had never stopped believing in him, who had written to him throughout his exile with a faithfulness and love that transcended every political catastrophe. Theodosia died. She had been traveling by ship from South Carolina to New York in January of 1813, sailing on the schooner Patriot, intending to reunite with her father after years of separation. The Patriot was lost at sea somewhere off Cape Hatteras. The ship was never found. Theodosia was never found. She was 29 years old. Aaron Burr never fully recovered. He continued to practice law in New York, subsisting on modest earnings, aging into a kind of eccentric eminence. He was old enough and sufficiently removed from the greatest disasters of his career that a new generation of New Yorkers encountered him simply as a remarkable old man, sharp, witted, endlessly charming, possessed of an almost preternatural ability to make the person he was speaking with feel as though they were the most important individual in the room. His office became a gathering place for young lawyers and politicians who came to hear his stories and absorb whatever wisdom could be extracted from a life of such spectacular heights and depths. He married again in 1833 at the age of 77. His second wife was Eliza Jumel, perhaps the wealthiest woman in New York, a former actress and courtesan who had married a wine merchant and outlived him. The marriage lasted approximately 4 months before Eliza filed for divorce, alleging adultery. She was granted the divorce on September 14, 1836. Aaron Burr died on the same day. He was 80 years old. But here is what the obituaries did not mention. Here is what the eulogies could not bring themselves to say. Because Aaron Burr's story does not end with his death, and the question of what he represents has only grown more complicated with time. Consider what Aaron Burr actually accomplished in that long, turbulent life. He was one of the first American politicians to deliberately organize a political machine. The same machine that, through his protégés and successors, eventually evolved into Tammany Hall. He argued cases on behalf of women's rights and the rights of immigrants when such arguments were almost unheard of. He was one of the first American politicians to argue seriously for women's suffrage, citing the work of Mary Wollstonecraft in his personal correspondence. He treated his daughter as an intellectual equal in an era when the education of women was considered not merely unnecessary, but potentially dangerous. He also, by every indication, plotted to sell American territory to foreign powers, killed the man who, more than any other, had built the financial architecture of the United States, and spent years recruiting an army to launch unauthorized military adventures in the name of his own ambition. Both of these things are true simultaneously. This is what makes Aaron Burr so maddening, so difficult to categorize, so persistently fascinating across 2.5 centuries. But let us return to the title of this story, to the claim embedded in it that demands examination: the man who killed 3 presidents. Hamilton, obviously, was not a president. He had never held the office. But his death reshaped the trajectory of American politics so fundamentally that historians have argued, with genuine force, that it effectively ended 3 presidential possibilities. First, there is Alexander Hamilton himself. In 1804, Hamilton was 50 years old, at the height of his intellectual powers, the leader of the Federalist Party, and by many accounts the most brilliant political mind of his generation. Whether he would have sought the presidency is uncertain. He had always been constitutionally barred from the highest office by his foreign birth, though there were those who argued the exact wording of the clause might not apply to him. More importantly, he was the intellectual and organizational force that kept the Federalist movement coherent and competitive. Without him, the Federalists collapsed. The one-party dominance of the Democratic Republicans that followed was, in a very real sense, a consequence of that pistol shot in Weehawken. Second, there is the case of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson's second term was shadowed and destabilized by the Burr conspiracy. The treason trial, the public spectacle, the exposure of corruption and scheming at the highest levels of the early republic. All of this damaged Jefferson's presidency and contributed to the toxic political atmosphere of his final years in office. The specific policies he wanted to pursue, particularly regarding confrontation with Britain over the impressment of American sailors, were undercut by the political damage of the Burr affair. The Embargo Act of 1807, widely considered one of the worst policy decisions of Jefferson's presidency, can be traced in part to the political weakness his administration suffered in the wake of the Burr trial. Whether a stronger, more politically confident Jefferson would have made different choices is impossible to know. But the damage was real, and its consequences rippled forward. Third, and most speculative but also most interesting, is the case of James Monroe. Monroe's presidency, from 1817 to 1825, coincided with what historians call the Era of Good Feelings, a period of apparent national unity following the War of 1812. But the political realignments that produced that era and the specific weaknesses in Monroe's position that eventually allowed the factionalism of the 1820s to tear the Democratic, Republican Party apart, can be traced back through a chain of cause and effect to the elimination of the Federalist opposition, to the poisoning of the political culture, to the long shadow of the Burr years. Monroe died in poverty in 1831 on July 4th, the same day as Jefferson and Adams 5 years earlier, a coincidence so extraordinary that it must be acknowledged even in a sober historical account. He died owing debts he could not pay, his presidency remembered as a missed opportunity. Aaron Burr's bullet killed Hamilton, but the ripple effects of that shot, combined with the treasonous conspiracy that followed, shaped the arc of 3 more presidencies in ways that go far beyond the immediate. Then, there are the 3 men whose names Burr apparently discussed in correspondence and conversation as possible future leaders of whatever Western empire he hoped to found. Men whose political careers were destroyed or permanently limited by association with the conspiracy. Men who had trusted Aaron Burr and found themselves ruined for it. And there is the matter of what Aaron Burr did with women. This is the part of the story that historians have, for many decades, handled with a certain delicacy that the subject perhaps does not deserve. Aaron Burr's sexual conduct was, by any standard, extraordinary. He kept detailed records in his private journal of his sexual encounters, records that historians have described as simultaneously fascinating and deeply troubling. The sheer number of women he slept with, across decades and social classes, suggests not merely a vigorous libido, but something more systematic, more predatory in its quality. There are accounts, some of them recorded in his own hand, that suggest his pursuit of women went well beyond the consensual libertinism of the era. He fathered, by various estimates, several illegitimate children, though the exact number is unknown. He used his position and his charm with a deliberateness that modern readers would recognize immediately, even if the vocabulary for naming it did not exist in 1800. This aspect of his character sits alongside his genuine advocacy for women's intellectual rights in a contradiction so jarring that it demands notice. The man who quoted Mary Wollstonecraft on female equality was also, apparently, a man who treated women as a category of conquest. History is not always comfortable. People are not consistent, but there is one more chapter to Aaron Burr's story that almost no one tells, and it is perhaps the most extraordinary of all. In 1833, in the last years of his life, Aaron Burr gave a series of conversations to Matthew L. Davis, his old political ally and the man he had chosen as his official biographer. Davis recorded these conversations at length, and in them, Aaron Burr said something that has echoed through American political thought ever since. He said that the American Republic was not, at its core, a democracy, that it was an experiment in elite governance, that the Founding Fathers had never actually believed in the capacity of ordinary people to govern themselves, and that the Constitution had been deliberately designed to filter popular will through institutions controlled by educated, propertied men. This was, in 1833, a profoundly radical thing to say. It was also, most historians now agree, substantially correct. The men who wrote the Constitution were not, for the most part, Democrats in the sense we would recognize. They feared the mob. They designed systems of indirect election, the Electoral College, the appointed Senate, the life-tenured Supreme Court, precisely to insulate government from direct popular pressure. Aaron Burr, the failed traitor, the duelist, the man with murder indictments and treason charges on his record, articulated this reality with a clarity that most of his contemporaries were unable or unwilling to achieve. Was that insight worth anything, or does the source contaminate the message? In his final years, aged and diminished but still mentally sharp, Aaron Burr was occasionally visited by young men who wanted to hear the old stories. He told them about the duel, always with the same careful framing, that Hamilton had effectively forced it, that he had given Hamilton every opportunity to retract his statements, that the Code Duel had left him no other honorable choice. He told them about the Western expedition in terms that emphasized its legitimate military planning aspects and glossed over the British approaches. He told them about the treason trial with genuine pride, pointing to his acquittal as vindication. He never, apparently, expressed regret. Not for Hamilton, not for Theodosia lost at sea, not for Blennerhassett, who had been ruined financially by the conspiracy and spent years trying to recover what Burr had cost him. Not for the young men who had followed him west on the promise of empire and found instead disgrace. This is perhaps the most chilling thing about Aaron Burr. Not the duel, not the conspiracy, not the treasonous negotiations with foreign powers. It is the absence of regret. The seamless continuity of self-justification across 8 decades of a life that had, by any objective measure, caused enormous damage to the people around him and to the republic he had sworn to serve. There are those who argue, and there is something to the argument, that Aaron Burr was simply a man who played by the rules of his time and was punished for losing. Dueling was legal, or at least legally tolerated. Political conspiracy was a frequent, if unacknowledged, feature of the era. Ambitious men had always sought their own advantage through whatever means were available. But something in that argument fails, because other men of the era, Hamilton himself, Jefferson, Madison, John Adams, also lived by the rules of their time, also maneuvered and schemed, and sometimes behaved in ways that would not pass modern ethical scrutiny. What distinguished Burr was not that he played by different rules. It was that he played for different stakes. He was willing, or appeared to be willing, to destroy the Republic itself if that was what his ambition required. Whether he fully understood what he was willing to do, whether the Western expedition was serious treason or hopeful opportunism, whether the British approach was a genuine offer or a hypothetical floated in a moment of bitterness. These questions cannot be answered definitively. The evidence is too fragmentary, the participants too unreliable, the distance too great. What we can say is this: Aaron Burr was the first American politician of national stature to treat the Republic not as an end in itself, not as a sacred project worth protecting at personal cost, but as a vehicle for individual ambition. He looked at the United States and saw not a cause but an opportunity. When the opportunity closed, he looked for another vehicle. Any vehicle, whatever was available. In doing so, he illuminated something about the fragility of Republican government that the founders had understood intellectually, but perhaps not viscerally. That the system depends, at every level, on the willingness of those within it to choose the Republic over themselves. Remove that willingness, and all the constitutional machinery in the world cannot prevent what Aaron Burr showed was possible. The trial of 1807 is sometimes described as a near miss, the moment when the United States almost suffered its first great act of internal treason. But in another sense, it was not a near miss at all. It was a revelation. Aaron Burr showed Americans what one man's ambition, unshackled from loyalty to anything beyond itself, was capable of attempting. And America, having seen it, did what America generally does with its most uncomfortable truths. It buried it. It tried to forget it. It made Aaron Burr into a villain and moved on, taking comfort in the fact that he had failed, choosing not to ask too carefully why he had tried. But the question that Aaron Burr raises: can a republic survive the ambitions of men who see it only as a means to their own ends? That question has not gone away. It turns out that Aaron Burr was not an anomaly. He was a preview. He died on September 14, 1836, in a boarding house on Staten Island, the room modest, the company sparse, the circumstances unremarkable for a man who had once nearly held the most powerful office in the New World. A stroke had taken most of his speech and his mobility in his final months. He died, by the accounts of those present, quietly. Without apparent regret, he was buried at Princeton near his father and grandfather, under a simple stone that gave only his name and dates. The man who had killed the Treasury Secretary conspired to dissolve the Union, approached foreign powers with offers of American territory, and acquitted himself of treason, now lay in the same ground as the theologians and scholars who had built the intellectual tradition he had inherited and spent his life squandering. Or had he squandered it? There is one more thing to say about Aaron Burr. One final thing that the history books rarely mention, and that may be the most important of all. In 1800, during the electoral crisis, when it became clear that the deadlock in the House might make him president instead of Jefferson, Aaron Burr made a choice. He declined to actively campaign for the presidency. He did not, as he could have, make deals with Federalist congressmen, offer concessions, trade promises of cabinet positions and patronage for their votes. He stood aside. Whether this was principle, a genuine belief that Jefferson had been the intended choice and that it would be wrong to take the office through the back door, or political calculation, a judgment that accepting the presidency under those circumstances would poison it beyond recovery. No one knows. But he did not take it. When he could have become president through entirely legal means, Aaron Burr stepped back. Is that the act of a man whose only ambition was the destruction of the republic? Or is it the act of a man more complicated than his legend allows? A man who, at crucial moments, chose restraint, even as at other moments he chose catastrophe. History does not offer clean answers about Aaron Burr. It offers only the life, in all its spectacular contradiction. The orphan who became a senator, the war hero who became a murderer, the vice president who became a traitor, the traitor who was acquitted, the exile who came home, the father who outlived his daughter and his reason for living. He was a man who looked at the American Republic and saw, perhaps more clearly than anyone, both its potential and its vulnerability. And then he decided, in some dark chamber of his extraordinary mind, that its vulnerability was more useful to him than its potential. The last line in his private journal, written just weeks before his final stroke in a hand grown shaky and uncertain with age, reads simply, "I have always believed that with proper management anything was possible." Anything. He meant it, he always had. That is the legacy of Aaron Burr. Not the duel, not the treason, not the exile, but that sentence, that belief, that conviction that the world was raw material for a sufficiently determined man. And the question he leaves behind, living in that sentence like a slow poison, is the same question the Republic has been asking itself ever since. What happens when the most brilliant man in the room decides that the rules do not apply to him? We are still finding out.